Before we get started with the show, we wanted to draw your attention to our crowdfunding page on Patreon. If you've been enjoying Always Take Notes, please do consider supporting us there. It helps us to keep the podcast going.
If you support us on Patreon, you can get a great selection of rewards as well as a shout out on the show. Thanks to our latest donor, Lulu Custer.
Lulu is from the Netherlands and is currently doing an internship at a music media platform. She did a minor in journalism, arts and social sciences at City University in London, and she's diving into the world of freelancing. Thank you very much for supporting the show, Lulu.
We've recently launched a new tier for our most generous supporters. If you pledge $20 a month, you get a free 2-month trial to Otter worth $26. Otter offers automated transcription and live note-taking for in-person and virtual meetings. I found it to be a huge help when transcribing a huge number of interviews for a reported piece. You also get access to a series of mini episodes from previous guests on the show in which they answer 3 revealing questions. The latest episode features Mei Zhong. Here's a snippet.
The first thing that comes to mind is go before you're ready. I think there's a tendency to want to get all your ducks and drakes in a row, but ultimately you can't inoculate yourself from all eventualities. You just need to go and do it. And if you're a reasonably thoughtful person, chances are very high that you are likely very ready, and I think you should just go for it. And also, as I'm saying though, I'm realizing that
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and myself spoke with playwright and screenwriter Jack Thorne.
We spoke to Jack about his early plays, about breaking into screenwriting with Skins, and about working with the BBC, HBO and Netflix.
It's a fascinating episode and we hope you enjoy it.
Welcome, Jack, to Always Take Notes. It's great to have you on the show. Could we start where all good stories begin, at the beginning? How did you get into writing?
By accident. I was at university and trying to be an actor. Well, trying to be an actor or a politician, and wasn't very good at either. And decided that I wanted to try directing, but discovered it cost £65 a night for amateur rights to put on a play. So decided to write a play to save that money, and then discovered the bit I liked was the writing bit. Though I kept directing for a while, I just wasn't very good at that either. So it was a process of, trial and error. And there were a lot of errors in choice of careers.
What had been your kind of initial exposure to drama? Had it been TV, or did you go to the theatre a lot as a child? How had the kind of form grabbed you?
Telly, a lot of telly, but also youth theatre, amateur dramatics. My mum and dad are very into amateur dramatics. And my dad did take us to the theatre, every now and again when there was the opportunity to do that. And then once I got into it, my dad tried to take me a bit more to the theatre. So yeah, but it was I was running Winslow in the Winslow Boy. It was doing bits and pieces like that with my mum and dad's dram company. So it was all that kind of thing, really.
So it's sort of in your DNA from a young age. What were some of those early plays at university about?
They were awful. One was called, one was an adaptation of a really lovely book called The Wave by Morton Rue. One was a reinterpretation of King Lear. Oh man, it was awful. Called You Have Been Loved, named after a George Michael song.
How did you reinterpret it? Like, did it all end happily? Or
No, it was sort of telling it from Edgar and Edmund's perspective, but it was dreadful. It was awful. It was one of the worst things ever. God, I can't remember. There was one called Boy Meets Girl, one called Tender. They were all pretty, but I was working it out, and people came, which was very nice. So, it was really good from that perspective, and you learn a lot from sitting watching an audience as they watch your thing.
I read on your Wikipedia profile, so who knows if this is true, but that you got a 2-2 at university. First, is that correct? And B, did it ever matter?
Yeah, I got Desmond. Yes, I'm very happy with that. I wasn't very good. I I never worked out how to write an essay. I always liked facts, and I always was quite good in meetings with people in terms of getting excited about ideas and facts, but I never really worked out how to express them on paper. And no one, people tried to help me, but I just didn't quite have that ability to, I got excited by weird stuff and not necessarily the right stuff in order to do some learning.
You mentioned how useful watching the audience was, and you were, I'm sure, very self-deprecating about those early experiments. But what did you learn from what you consider to be failures in terms of your early work?
What 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 was funny, because I was writing a lot of funny stuff or trying to write funny stuff, and what you can, it's like a comedian, a stand up will say you have to stand up on stage and you have to just kind of work out that what people might find funny in the room is very different from what people might find funny on stage. So there was a lot of that. There was a lot of what people find truthful, and the big thing is, what stops the sweet rappers is and the coughing. Do you know what I mean? That is the test, I think, for every dramatist, and everyone knows it. That those moments of stillness in a theatre where suddenly everything just kind of goes quiet. Those moments, you can feel them, and they are the most exciting moments you have as a writer. And yeah, I definitely learned about those moments, and there were a couple in those plays, but there was just a lot of coughing moments beside them.
How did you go about making your way into it professionally after university in terms of getting an agent, getting your first kind of paid gigs and things? Talk us through that.
I'd read a thing with Paul Abbott where he said if someone will pay you to write a menu, then take that job. Uh, so I did a lot of like scouting around for strange things to do, and a lot of um, digital networking. I can't talk to people. I have no ability to talk to people, but I did a lot of Mandy.com was big at the time, shooting people, and I would contact people on that site and do things like that. At the same time, I was writing plays all the time and sending them off to theatres. And sort of two things happened at the same time, which is that because of a short I'd written, a producer called Ivana McKinnon said, "Would you like to write a film for? We've got this small monetary fund to pay newbie writers to write first drafts of a film for us." And I wrote a film called Scouting Book for Boys, which then she got made amazingly. And at the same time, I submitted to Teresa Topolsky at the Tricycle, um, a a play I'd written for National Youth Theatre called A Bedroom, and she said this is quite good, and she gave it to Mike Bradwell and the team at the Bush, and they commissioned a second draft of that, and that play became When You Cure Me. So those two things sort of happened simultaneously, um, and then as a result of When You Cure Me, I got Skins, and suddenly I was working in television. So it all just sort of happened in a great big ball of fun when I was 25, and I got very lucky, um, but got lucky from lots of different angles, if that makes sense.
Before you had that sort of confluence of breaks, how hard was it to make a living? I mean, were you had a job during the day and then you were writing in your spare time?
Yeah, and my brother let me live in his house. My brother lived in Croydon, and he let me live in his house for very little rent, which was very kind of him. And that also made it a bit easier too. But yeah, it was a lot of. I was working as a learning support worker. I was doing lots of different bits and pieces of jobs, working as part of a gifted and talented program at another place. But I was trying to survive on 3 days a week work, and then having 4 days to write, and that meant getting to know the bargain shelves at the supermarket very well and all that kind of thing. But it was amazing.
Can we talk about Skins then, about how that came about and then what your role was there? And, A lot of our listeners will be really interested in playwriting and know a lot about it, but a lot and drama, but a lot will really not. So just take us through, how you got there, and then what the nature of the job was, how collaborative it was. Were you working with other writers? Just really kind of lift the lid on that whole experience.
Yeah, so I got it because Jamie Britton came to see a reading of When You Cure Me when we just had it. We did a paid reading so people could buy tickets to come and see it, and at the Bush before it was commissioned to be put on as a performance, and he liked that and said to me afterwards, quite shyly in the bar, and Jamie was very young then. I think he was 20 years old, but came up to me in the bar afterwards and went, "I think you could write for my show." And I was like, "You've got a TV show? That's amazing." And he said, "Yeah, it's going to be called Skins, and it's going to be on E4." And I didn't know what E4 was, and I didn't know anything about him, obviously, because he was just getting started. And then his dad, who he co-created the show with, Brian Owsley, came to the second night of the run and talked to me in the bar afterwards and went, "My son came and saw you. Do you remember him?" And I was like, "The TV guy? Of course I remember him." And then he said, come and work on the show, and that's sort of how it started. So I was the third writer in after Jamie and Brian, and at the start it was just the three of us sitting in a room, and then slowly more and more people joined the room, and there was a team of screenwriters, Ben Schiffer, um, Simon Amstel, me, Brian and Jamie, and then there was a group of young contributors, one of whom was Daniel Kaluuya, who was 16 years old at the time. And we'd meet every Wednesday between 11 and 5 and just talk about, we'd watch an episode of something, a teen drama generally, and then we'd talk about what worked and what didn't, and then we'd talk about what other scripts had come in that week. And it was an incredible education. And the other key part of the education was being guided by a script editor called Chloe Moss and Brian himself in writing the two scripts I wrote for that first series. And literally, he taught me everything about what a writer should be, whilst also allowing me quite a lot of space to make mistakes and mess things up and find different ways through the story. It was an incredible experience.
Is that quite unusual to, because you hear a lot about writers' rooms in America, but you don't hear, as far as my understanding, you don't have the same setup in Britain where people actually sit in a room together. You'll have a team of writers, but they might go away and write a script each, but it'll be overseen by someone like a script editor.
Yeah, it's changing quite a lot at the moment, and the writers' room system has definitely been brought into this country as the streamers get more and more powerful, and certainly, and to some degree that's brilliant, and in other degrees that's not. It's a weird time at the moment, and the industry is in quite a lot of flux in terms of what the model is, because the British model did tend to be a writer sits in their room, writes a script, and then the script gets made with a lot of input along the way. Skins wasn't quite a writer's room in terms of we didn't sit for a month together breaking down the story into different pieces and then hive it off. It was much more, let's keep writing, and while we write, let's talk, rather than breaking the episodes and then writing the episodes. I mean, and I'm not a huge fan of that, to be honest. From my process, that I don't really want to sit in a room for a month. I like writing being a surprise, and I think sometimes really interesting work comes out of writing being a surprise. But it's happening, and it is changing the industry quite a lot as it does.
You say a surprise. Is that a surprise to you who are writing it, or a surprise to the people you then take the work to?
Yeah, no, it's a surprise to me that you shouldn't, that to some degree knowing where you're going is brilliant, and to other degrees knowing where you're going is deadly, because you are always constrained by the possibilities of what you've pre-decided about your characters, when your characters can do things that don't necessarily do. They can behave in ways that aren't necessarily that are beyond the box you put them in.
It's really interesting because I think there's an image of screenwriters with their sort of post-it notes on the wall with their characters. You know, strand A is this, strand B is this, and this is where it's going to end up. But you like to introduce some sort of serendipity into the writing process.
Yes, and a lot of writers do. I mean, I'm not the only one. Ronald Harwood, I think, is the person I've stolen, that he likes the idea of a surprise, and I really believe in that. I mean, I did a writing course once. I taught on a writing course once, and in which we broke down the first episode of Shameless. And knowing Paul's process, I don't think he's someone that does post-it notes. It doesn't feel to me like he's someone that does post-it notes. And then you break it down, and there's a perfect structure there, like literally perfect. Shameless episode 1 of series 1 is just perfect. And that will be because he's been given a lot of guidance and help along the way. But that's also because if you've watched a lot of TV, you've got things inside you that, you've got a rhythm inside you. You've got the notion of what everything should be inside you. You've got the notion of the advert break inside you and what the advert break should do. And, the upward breath of an advert break. And if you're heading towards those bits and you're thinking about those bits, then what takes you there doesn't necessarily have to be something that you preordained. But the structure is inside you somewhere. TV is quite a structured medium, and so you don't necessarily need to pre-decide the structure before you write it, or at least that's what I think.
It's interesting because when we have novelists on the show, we always ask them this plot or plunge question as to whether they have it determined beforehand, and we get completely varied answers, which is fascinating. I suppose I had no screenwriting experience, but I've read Save the Cat, and I was sort of astonished at how prescriptive that was. That you could go into a Hollywood film with a stopwatch and be like, right, we're 40 minutes in, they're about to have the moment when all fails. I mean, what do you think of that kind of interplay between the serendipity of it and hitting the beats and the arc and everything like that?
It depends what kind of film you're writing, and it depends what you're writing it for. And there are certain lessons that probably are inside you anyway. I don't love those books. I don't. The books that I read and devoured were books like William Goldman's Which Lie Did I Tell, and More Adventures in the Screen Trade and stuff like that, where it was very much based on what he was discovering as he wrote scripts, rather than theorists who aren't scriptwriters who are telling you what the system should be. But if it produces brilliant work, then that's fantastic. And for some people, it does produce brilliant work. But take a film like Moonlight, take a film like Parasite. Do you know what I mean? You won't find anything that fits within those rule systems. Nomadland. Those are extraordinary films, and the idea of rules within them is ridiculous.
One of the things those books sort of advocate are, exercises to get into your character's minds, be it sort of diary entries, or there's one called Closet, which you may be familiar with. Do you do any of that when you're preparing to write a script, or do you just sort of go in?
I don't even know Closet.
It's like
enlighten us, Rachel.
It's you have to come up with a character, a location, an object. I've actually only seen the first 3, so I don't know what SAT stand for. But it's basically you come up with them, and then you have to try and create a story that fits those, incorporates all those things. So I think it's get your creative juices flowing. But it's just one of those games that you can play, I think.
Yeah, no, I don't do any of that. I do try and write scenes quite early on, and I do try and see, even if it's a planning process, I do try and get used to writing dialogue for a character, and I do throw away a lot of work. So I do, hit the ground running and then trip up and then dust myself down and then start off in a new direction. But and that is to some degree doing that. But mostly it's just trying to write the script and trying to see what they talk like and trying to see how they move and the disastrous decisions they make. rather than, yeah.
So we're really fascinated by this process stuff on the podcast, to the extent that it has been suggested that process is in fact the word of the podcast. But I was wondering if we could talk about your process in some more detail, and perhaps through an example. I know we're jumping around a bit chronologically, but I've been watching National Treasure this week, which I really enjoyed. And could we just maybe just talk about that from the beginning, from the conception of the idea through your working methods, the edits, like just really the real like procedural of how the sausage gets made.
So that started with a lunch, which sounds very Hollywood. I think it's the only lunch I've ever been on where I've been pitched like that, and it was George Faber, who's a hero of mine, and who was the exec producer of Skins and Shameless, which was where I started. So it's someone that I'd been aware of for a very, very long time. And he was just starting out his new company, on Leaving Company Pictures, called The Forge. And he took me to lunch and he said, I think there is a drama to be written about someone within this crisis. So someone in the center of this historic sex crime crisis. And the thing that he said to me, which made me prick up my ears, is that you tell it from the perpetrator's perspective and how you get inside that. And we started talking, and we talked about a few people, probably whom I shouldn't name for legal reasons, who've been through these things. And we talked about those images of those families walk into court and the way that those families operate. And that was my starting point: how to get inside those families, how to tell the story of those families. And I went away and wrote a draft. There wasn't any real um, discussion beyond that until I produced the first ep. And I produced this first ep, and I tried to do. I've been working. Me and Shane Meadows had been working I think we'd done 88, and I think we were in the process of writing this thing to 90 by that point. So we worked together three or four times, and one thing that we'd got into by that point was the idea of longer scenes, and we got very excited by them. If you've seen those shows, you'll see how excited. And the Virtues, I think there's like 6 scenes in the whole bloody show. But we got very into like the way that television can do that, the way that television can stop time. And so one thing I did in the middle of Act One of National Treasure was write um, a 20-minute scene, a 20-page scene in the middle of it between Paul and Dee, which got cut down slightly in the edit, but that sort of notion.
Which one is that?
The one where he goes to her apartment and they're just talking, and she tells the story of her dream and all and all
and
that
the priest and that sort of
exactly,
thing.
Exactly. So and that sort of set a structure for how we wanted to tell it in terms of those long scenes and those long examinations, and that it's going to be trying to look inside the head of a damaged person, and that question as to what that damage means and whether that damage means he's damaged others. And the thing we had at the beginning was that there was going to be a moment where we went away and we told the story of someone that was the victim of him. And then the longer the show went on, the more it felt like the way we can do that is through the daughter, and that by staying within this tight unit, we can ask questions about the legal system. We can ask questions about the perversion of celebrity, and we can be slightly more damning than if we were trying to tell a full story. By telling a partial story well, we could do something that felt like it had the impact that we wanted to have. And the interesting thing is that then you go on to these discussions about how we deal with press and all those kind of things. And the thing that we were trying to say in press all the time, which we really believed, is we didn't want to be the definitive Jimmy Savile drama. We didn't want to be the drama that told that entire story, that needed to be told by other people, that needed to be told by other writers, frankly. We wanted to be a part of that. And there have been dramas since, like Three Girls, that aren't exactly looking at that sort of thing, but are looking at it from a different perspective. So we didn't want to say, oh, we are the Jimmy Savile drama, but we felt like this was our way of telling the story of a particular box within that.
With something that's obviously so sensitive, how do you establish a tone, from your desired tone from the outset of the script?
You do a lot of talking to people. And actually, I wrote Ep1 and then we started doing a hell of a lot of research. You start to you talk to police, you talk to victims, you talk to and you we made the decision we weren't going to talk to anyone that was being prosecuted because we felt like that wasn't something we necessarily needed, that we had an idea of how we were going to tell that part of the story. But and you hope that that truth sort of seeps into you, and that you have those people then on your shoulders all the time who are your Jiminy Crickets saying, do us justice and don't fail us. And it's terrifying, but that I think really helps. In terms of the tone, you never want to fall into a trap. For me, or the thing that I'm always worried about is falling into the trap of the polemic, where there's a simple answer to the question. You want to make it complicated because these cases are complicated, and if you present a case that's simple, if you tell the story of Harvey Weinstein, you're not going to tell a very interesting story that requires people to think, or you're going to tell the story of a monster, and you're going to watch that monster be exposed slowly. Whereas if you tell the story of, I don't know if you've seen the film The Assistant, it's a tremendous film. But what they've done is they've told the story of a young woman in an office where this perversion is clearly occurring, and how she then works through the issue, and you're seeing the systems that protect Weinstein, which is a lot more interesting than seeing the monster himself. And the systems that protect Weinstein are almost more condemning because you can see how it happens. Whereas with him, you just kind of go, he's an aberration of a man, and you don't know anyone like Weinstein, but you know an awful lot of people who protected him. And by looking at that protection network, you are asking a more profound question, I think.
How does your involvement then continue as the thing is being made, as it's being filmed and so forth? Perhaps again in the context of National Treasure. Do you at some point just hand it over to the producer and the director and they do it, or are you doing rewrites as it's being produced? Again, on the process, how does that work?
You're always doing rewrites. Mark Munden, who directed National Treasure, who I've worked with 3 times and love dearly, also has a rehearsal process. So you're in a room with the actors for 2 weeks prior to filming, when you're analysing characters and building and rebuilding certain bits to fit them, and challenging them, and they're challenging you as you're going through the process. We're just and then you're rewriting all the time because of different things. So Mark and I are shooting at the moment, and we have locked a script, but there's changes because of last minute casting changes. There's changes because of music rights clearances. There's changes because of this, that, and the other that are causing all sorts of little ructions within the show. And also, I'm getting calls from, in this case, Stephen Graham and Jodie Comer to say, I'm going through the sides for tomorrow. I've got an idea of how to do something slightly different that suits me slightly better. Is that okay? And that's, I love that bit of the process where they're sort of taking on authorship responsibility for the story and becoming authors themselves.
You have to be pretty flexible then. I mean, your work is very much not done once you've put the words on the page.
No. Yeah, no. I mean, you do monstrous amount of drafts. It's a very, very collaborative medium, and telly's particularly collaborative because there's also the big thing of budget, which affects film to some degree, but film, you tend to have arrived at a budget a bit earlier on. Telly, the moment when a line producer gets involved is quite late on, and so you're constantly skinning the dog as you're trying to find a way to afford the show and make it filmable. So yeah, no, it's a constant sort of adjustment and readjustment. But
one of my favorite stories is in this country when they had to rewrite a scene to just be set in the kitchen because they didn't want to set up loads of different locations, and they wrote that brilliant episode that's just about like the turkey dinosaurs and the pizzas. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's a brilliant workaround for what was a budget problem.
yeah, well, Daisy and Charlie, my wife manages Daisy and Charlie, so I love them, and I love the way that they find solutions to things.
On the kind of dynamics of the whole industry and stuff, there's a book that I was recommended by Patrick Radden Keefe, the American writer, called Monster: Living Off the Big Screen. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's by John Gregory Dunn, who was Joan Didion's husband, who was like a sort of serious. And they had this weird split life where they were writing like really serious journalism and like books and stuff in New York half the time, and they lived in LA the other half the time doing like all this screenwriting work. And it's an absolutely hilarious book. The premise is that they were commissioned in the mid-80s to adapt, I think, this drama about a really serious story about the suicide of a really troubled TV anchor. And then it got bought by Disney and went through 48 drafts and became a rom-com with Robert Redford. But it's an absolutely hilarious book, but it's about Hollywood in the 90s, and it's just kind of crazy excess, like money. The Japanese have bought the studios but have no idea how it's going on. And obviously it's a kind of pastiche, but like, what kind of world is it that, TV and film?
So British TV and film is very different from American film. I've only really made one TV show that was made largely with American money, so I don't really know, but I've made a few films that were made with American money. It is very different. It can be crazy. And I can't tell you the crazy stories because I would get in trouble. But there have been crazy stories of, doing rewrites for specific actors. There's this thing called weeklies, and weeklies are very nice jobs, which are really satisfying to do. Actually, where you're paid for a week or 2 weeks to solve a specific problem in the script, and you're just brought on to have a look at it and reshape it. And I tend to get the character passes. That's what I get hired to do every now and again, is to do a character pass for a specific actor or a studio note. And then you go in and you just got to kind of get your spanner out and do it. That's, I'd say, technical script writing. And I like technical script writing, and certainly if you're at the end of a project where you feel like you're battered and bruised all over the place, there's something really nice about going in and getting your spanner out and feeling successful for a little bit, feeling like you've done something of worth and people being grateful for your work rather than disappointed in you. Yeah, and that is the crazier end of Hollywood, in that it feels like, scriptwriters become two a penny then, but it does. They are looking for a very specific type of film. Those projects, and they are generally very, very good at getting that kind of film. And you are aware of that, and you're aware that there's a producer's eye on the whole process, and that's more of an authorial eye than a single writer is. And that's where you get films like where a TV anchor becomes, where it becomes a rom-com for Robert Redford. On other things, you've got a surprising amount of latitude. I mean, I did Enola Holmes for Legendary. Legendary are a huge studio who make huge films. And Enola Holmes was a very important part of their slate for them, but they gave me so much space, and I was given one of the best notes I've ever been given after the read through of that, which had been a pretty good read through. And Mary Parent, who runs Legendary, went, I still can't feel her emotional journey. I still can't feel Enona's emotional journey. And we started talking about it, and she said, "That's all brilliant. You now have 5 days, and in those 5 days, you need to pretend like you've never written this show before. I'm imploring you to rewrite yourself, but you've got to rewrite yourself like you weren't the writer who's done this whole process." And actually, that was like a really, really, it was a really kind of freeing note to just kind of go at it like you would a writer employed to do a weekly on it. And she had no intention of bringing in another writer for it. She wanted it to be my voice all the way through, but she wanted me to really challenge myself at that moment. And she was really right. It made a huge difference to what the film felt like.
I mean, is that not really difficult? Because I find if I've been working on something for ages, you get too close to it. It's very hard to see, how to fix it. Is it because you had the guidance of the emotional journey, you'd already talked about it, you sort of knew where you needed to focus your attention?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I'd heard it. I'd heard Millie read it as well, so I had Millie's voice in my head. Um, but it was also just, oh right, okay, that's my job. And if I want to make this film as good as possible, I've got to put everything all my, all the trials and tribulations of writing a film. I've got to sort of put them in a black box, and then, and then live in a white room where anything was possible again. And obviously by then there was so much stuff that was set in stone in terms of we'd scheduled locations, we'd done all this kind of stuff, so there were limits to what I could do. But it was just a really good provocation. But yeah, rewriting is the worst. That rewriting draft. I mean, I did 46 drafts at one of his Dark Materials. Um, Rewriting from draft 30 onwards is pretty bleak. It's a bleak experience because you're just kind of going, I don't quite know how to do this anymore. But then you reach out, and the good thing about telly is there are people that are there to support you, and there are people there that have got the interest of the project at the front of their brain, and so will help you fight the fires that you need to fight in order to make it work.
When it's one of those cases where it's got to 40 drafts or so, is that because there's a difference of vision, like how you want to do it and how the producer wants to do it is distinct? Or have you experienced situations like that where there's been, someone who else wants to do it differently from how you want to do it?
Yeah, I mean, on his Dark Materials, it was because we were trying to sell it to America, and it's a bewildering book. And it's a bewildering book that's full of ideas. And it wasn't a difference of opinion between me and Jane. We were always sort of getting to places at draft 5, draft 10, draft 15, where we were happy with what we'd done. But then we'd be set a challenge by another broadcaster. And because we needed the money of an American sale, we were rising to meet that challenge. And with his Dark Materials, we went in lots of different directions in order to do that, and directions where suddenly the magisterium were behaving in a different way, where dust was explained, where different things happened in different orders in order to provoke us to feel an emotional charge at a different point about Lyra. That it was a frantic search for something that everyone could believe in, and that was tough. But we got to make the show, and we've got to make 3 series of the show because of those 46 drafts, because we found a place that people were comfortable to invest in the show. But yeah, it was tough.
In terms of adaptation, I heard a great quote, now I can't remember who it's from, helpfully, that you need to be promiscuous to be faithful. Is that something that you agree with? And how do you approach source material, particularly very beloved source material like his Dark Materials, Harry Potter, Enola Holmes as well, to an extent?
It all depends on what task you've been set. And also, I think the question you need to ask yourself right in the beginning of the process is, how loyal do I need to be? And on his Dark Materials, it felt like this is the definitive medium for his Dark Materials. TV feels like, if it's going to get a satisfying adaptation anywhere, that TV feels like the great big opportunity for it. So we need to be constantly returning to the books. We need to be constantly challenging ourselves. On A Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens has had his day, in that it's been done 50 million times, by 50 million different dramatists. So the question is not how do I do my best by Charles Dickens, it's how do I do my version of A Christmas Carol, because everyone knows it and everyone's seen it a million times, and we've got to do something that's fresh and provocative. So it's that sort of, it's the question of loyalty. So I like promiscuous in order to be faithful, but I think that the degree of promiscuity, the degree to which you've got those what those things you put outside your house if you're a swinger, pampas grass.
We don't know, Jack. Tell us.
You've never heard about pampas grass?
I've never heard about pampas. I have pampas grass in my living room. Maybe I need to reposition it.
Right.
Yeah. No. If you've got pampas grass in your front garden, it means
I didn't mean to put it outside, by the way. I meant to put it away from the window. I just realised how that sounded.
So if you so I suppose it's the degree to which you've got your pampas grass. Yeah.
It's a rule of the show that we always ask about money and how it interfaces with people's writing lives, and be as specific or as general as you want to be. But how does it work? What are the units?
I thought you were going to ask how much money have you
Well,
got?
I mean, we'd love to know, but you don't have to answer us. But how are you're paid by the what is the unit? Is it by the page, by the word, and then how, as your profile is built, have the amounts? How is it worked out? And again, we don't want to totally grill you here, but obviously we want to know as much as you'll tell us. So
film and TV are well paid mediums. The difference between film and TV is in film you're paid by the draft, whereas in TV you're paid by the product at the end of it. So in film you can do a draft of something which pays a lot better than a year's work on TV. Theatre is weirder because the amount you get paid up front is less. If the show is successful and has a future life, a commercial life, then you get a constant ongoing income. Whereas with film and TV, there's a little bit of that after the event, but mainly it gets swallowed up in accounting. So, Wonder, a film I wrote, did very well for its budget, but the money, I've never got more money for it. And I knew that would be the case, and I'm totally comfortable with that. It just goes somewhere in a book somewhere. So yes, and then certainly if you get a film on streaming now, you're not going to get money for. I think they are negotiating that now, and I don't quite know where it's at in terms of the amount of streams you get will change the money that you get as a result. But I certainly haven't seen any streaming money for anything that I've written.
And how much of a difference to your, I guess, how much money you could ask for did working on things like Harry Potter and winning prizes for that? What difference did that make to your profile?
It's really hard to work that out, partly because I'm doing so much at the same time. I don't think it made a great difference to my TV career, for instance. I think for film, it probably did have an impact. And certainly that thing of having something which you can kind of go, that worked, and that worked in a way that it worked commercially and critically, is really helpful. But there's not many of those kind of plays. And so it's not like, oh, you've written Star Wars, now you can write Star Trek, and do you know what I mean? And Godzilla, and do you know what I mean? It's not like that kind of thing. It's much more sort of like, oh, that worked, and that was lovely. I mean, Harry Potter was the biggest change I think it made was in my confidence, and I'm still. It's a divisive play, so although it's a really amazing thing to be part of, it's still the thing that I get the most tweets and stuff sent me about how ashamed of myself I should be for writing it, which I totally understand why people feel that passionately, actually, and I think fan passion is not something to be afraid of, but it did make a difference to my confidence in terms of just that thing of sitting in a theatre that was absolutely full of people that were really excited by what you've done, and I was part of a team, you can't really analyze which bit was you and which bit was other people. But when tears are shed for characters that you've written, and you feel the whole theatre is weeping, that's really exciting, and it does empower you as a writer. I do, I still get a kick out of watching the show with people, though I haven't for a while.
We've had various writers on the show who do some screenwriting in conjunction with, say, writing novels or writing non-fiction. How do, I suppose, you and other pros, as it were, who are through and through screenwriters, how do you feel about these carpetbaggers who come in and say
oh wow, right, okay, yeah, no, get off our porch. No, I think it's brilliant, and and Normal People was a massive hit, and that was a collaboration, I know, between Alice Birch and Sally Rooney, but I'm sure that there were times when it really benefited from her authorial voice. No, I think it's exciting. I hope it doesn't get to a situation where adaptation becomes the thing that's exclusively done by authors, because I like adapting stuff, but that's just personally me. Yeah.
You've mentioned doing a lot of projects at one time. Could you tell us a little bit about how you juggle all of those different things and what your sort of working hours are like? It's a sort of theme of the podcast that some people are very close to burning out and work ridiculously long hours every day, 7 days a week. Are you one of those people?
Yes. No, I've got a kid, and the kid is, I'm doing homeschool at the moment, so my hours are greatly reduced. I love working. Before I met Rach, my wife, I was living alone in Luton, and very happily working 7 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day. And it didn't, I got a huge kick out of it. I think writing is the greatest thing in the world, and I am absolutely psychologically dependent upon it. When I'm in a bad mood, Rach will send me off to write to make me better. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not someone who struggles with that thing of getting in front of a computer. I like it, and so I would do it all the time if it weren't for the fact that I have a family and I love them too.
How important is it to be in London if you're making your way in film and TV? You mentioned Luton, because I once spent a week in a travel lodge in Luton for a huge story about Luton Town Football Club. I embedded with them and I went shopping with them, central midfield and everything like that. So I've served a bit of an apprenticeship in Luton. But how important is it to come to London and be in that Milo of theatre and TV?
For a playwright, when I was coming through, it was quite important. I hope it's becoming less important now. I certainly never wanted to live in London. I live in London because my wife has a job here. I don't consider myself as having a job here. My main work is in Cardiff, where His Dark Materials was filmed, or in Paris, where The Eddie was filmed. That I'm wherever the show is, and can move around a lot. And, my longest working relationship is with Shane Meadows. Shane lives in Nottingham, and very happily lives in Nottingham, and no one requires Shane to come to London too much, and he doesn't come to London too much. But for theatre writing at the time when I was coming through, that thing of being in shows and meeting people and just being around for those sorts of events, I think had an importance. Although I wish it wasn't so.
So in ordinary times, obviously, we're in the midst of COVID at the minute. You'd be travelling really quite a lot.
Quite a lot. I actually need to travel more than I did. I was getting into a place where I'm very shy and find going to set really difficult because it requires me to make conversation with people, and I find that exhausting. And I'd much rather be at my computer writing, and I'd sort of constructed a world for myself where I was the person that sat at his computer rather than went to set. And I actually think that was a mistake, and that I needed the relationship that being at set allows you to foster. So when Ordinary Times returns, hopefully, I will be going to set more than I had been.
What's your thought on the whole streaming services piece? Obviously, it's a massive subject, and we had Emily Hayward Whitlock, the book to film agent, on a few weeks ago, and she talks very interestingly about, you know, what that's done and how it's changing the power dynamics and where the money is, and also the kind of work that's being produced. What do you feel about that?
It's hard to know at the moment, and if we have seen the toppling of theatrical, if that is what's happened, and if AMC can't come back, you know, in America and really and come back with the number of cinemas that they had, if it becomes much more of a niche thing going to the cinema, then the whole world of it is going to change. Streaming is, I mean, to some degree, it just changes the choices that are made. But I don't think anyone can say that theatrical was in a good place. You know, that we were heading into a world where it was literally only the superhero film, and that was the only thing that was breaking through, and that the number of non-superhero films that were breaking through were becoming less and less, and that was partly due to the death of the star, and the death of someone that just could go, I'm Will Smith, and I'm going to make a film about the pursuit of happiness. You know, as soon as that dynamic started to change, then the film just literally became exclusively men and occasionally women in capes. And I like those films. I just don't want to be fed them as you know, as a sole diet. Streaming, we are that I don't think I can say actually, but you know that to some degree that the choices are still based on an algorithm of sorts, and to some degree there is a notion of what an audience needs on Netflix and what an audience needs on Disney Plus and all those kind of things. But because what they're looking for is passion rather than just simply numbers, so their metrics are not just how many people watched Enola Holmes. It's how many people would stay on the service because of Enola Holmes, how many people joined up to the service because of Enola Holmes, how many people were brought to Netflix because of Enola Holmes, how much was Enola Holmes penetrating worldwide, all those sorts of things. And where did Enola Holmes do well? It might lead to the choices will be different, and it might lead to a really interesting new diversity of films. And certainly the appetite towards the more independent film does seem to be larger on Netflix than it was in the multiplex. But who knows? And we're in the middle of a streaming war at the moment where they are making so much content. Once that dies down, and once there are clear leaders, and once certain people have bought other people, so that you know, there's these great big fat things out there that we all subscribe to. What that will mean, I don't know. But I mean, I've got a film that's happening, which I don't think I can talk about, but it's happening because of Netflix money, and it is far from, you know, it involves two young women, neither of whom are stars, and it's predominantly in another language, and it's about something that's quite complicated and difficult. And I've co-written it with someone that's much cleverer than me, but it's you know, it's a film that I'll be really proud to have made, and I don't know that it would have been made in a more traditional model.
I'm going to go and look that up on IMDb Pro after this. We're coming towards the end of our time, so I just wondered if I could ask one more question about whether there's a project that you've wanted to do for ages and haven't got it done, or so, you know, what's your ideal adaptation or story that you haven't written yet but would like to?
I'd like to write something really good, and I that's honestly my intention every morning, and I've written stuff I'm really proud of. I think there's a project out there that if I get right, will be you know, will be better. And I'd say it's probably to do with disability, and disability certainly is my focus, because I think socially it's really important that we are telling stories about disability, and because of my history as a disabled person, and because of my involvement in the disabled world, feels like something I can have a unique angle on. but the fight to get disabled representation on screen is huge, and we haven't won it. And it's starting to change. The likes of Ruth Madeley are making it start to change, but it's a really, really slow journey. And so yes, I'd like to write something really good, preferably about disability. That's what I'd like to do.
And I've got a really quick follow up on that. Actually, we're close to time, but could you talk a bit about how the experience of illness has affected your work? And so, you have this condition with heat. Is that right?
Yes, I spent 6 months bedbound because I became allergic not just to physical and artificial heat, but also to my body heat. So I was provoking reaction whenever I moved. And it took me about 15 years to get over it. And I'm not a disabled person anymore, but I was a disabled person during that time. And yeah, it was huge because I couldn't do what other people did. And the restrictions on me were far less than the restrictions on some of my friends in terms of the lives they have to lead. But yeah, it was seismic, and coming out as a disabled person and sort of being accepted in the disabled community was also massive for me. And I have deep awe and respect for disabled artists, and very proud to consider myself one of the number.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Jack. I know that you're extremely busy, so we really appreciate you.
No, thank you so much.
Making time for us.
I'm really, really chuffed to be on this thing. So thank you very much.
Hello, it's us again. Rachel, what did you take away particularly from the talk with Jack?
Firstly, I feel like we did not even scratch the surface of what we could have talked to Jack about. I mean, the hour went very, very quickly. The thing that stood out for me was the number of drafts he did for his art materials, and that seems to be a theme that comes through when working in TV and film. Just the amount of collaboration and the amount of people that have input, and the number of notes that you have to take from producers and directors and everyone else. I mean, it's quite different to the work that you and I do, where there is a point where it's finished. I think obviously there is a point where it's finished in TV, but
yeah, I think that's really true. And it's like the idea that it's not really a sort of auteur model at all, right? That it's multiple people. I mean, I drew that from him as well. I think I love having these screenwriters on. I think it's really great that we've now had him and James Graham as well, because it's not a world I know a huge amount about. But he was just a really gracious guy, I thought, and kind of I watched some National Treasure before we did it, and I found that was very powerful and kind of very humble as well, given the level of success he'd had as well. So I think it was really good. What have you been up to, Rachel?
I feel like every time we ask you ask me this, I have nothing new to say because of lockdown and because I'm just doing the same things as usual. But you have some very exciting news.
I do, yeah. My book came out last week. That's The Changing of the Guard, the British Army since 9/11. It's creating an interesting response. Yeah, it's been good. There's been some a lot of press coverage. Some of it really, really positive. Some very well. There's been a debate. We'll put it that way. But yeah, it's been good. I mean, it's just unfamiliar territory, right? I've not been through this before, and it's weird because it had been, something I've been working on for so long, and the route to getting it out was so challenging. But it's great. It's in the world, and there's a lot of chat and a lot of buzz about it. And I think that ultimately is a really positive thing. I think the experience, if you had a book that you'd worked on for years and it just sort of sunk, would be absolutely heartrending. And it's definitely not what is happening with this.
So does it feel like a weight off your shoulders now that it's out there in the world?
I don't know. It's sort of it just feels really unfamiliar. Like I haven't been through this process before. It feels like it doesn't. I think the key thing is like it doesn't belong to you anymore, right? Like people go and read it and they form judgments on it and post slightly weird photos of it on Twitter and stuff like that. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think we'll have to see what comes and what next. Obviously, we'll talk about this in more detail on the podcast coming up. But yeah, it's been a really good launch so far, and I think by the time this goes out to air, there'll be some more stuff in the public domain about it. So yeah, that's what's been going on with me. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Aiken.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer is Artemis Irvin, our graphic design is by James Edgar, and our score is by Jess Danheiser.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Always Take Notes, on Twitter at Take Notes Always, on Patreon at Always Take Notes, and if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.